And we're live. Welcome to Music Matters with Jason Tramm, and thank you for joining us for our unique podcast community, where we explore the triumphs and challenges of the performing arts world as seen through the eyes of distinguished artists. And thank you so much for helping us grow. We hit 2,110 subscribers as of today, and we grow every day thanks to people like you who like our videos and subscribe to our channel. It means the world to us. We have a wonderful show today. We have Mr. Warren Cohen, a Canadian composer, conductor, and pianist, who is the music director of the Musica Nova Orchestra based in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the New Jersey Intergenerational Orchestra, and he's currently based in New Jersey. Welcome, Warren Cohen.
Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure. I got to meet you in person a few weeks ago, and it was a pleasure, and it's always great to meet colleagues. And tell us a little bit about how you became a conductor.
Well, the way I became a conductor is kind of, in one sense, the very traditional route. I was a pianist who worked a lot in musical theater. I worked in ballet, and I was music director of a bunch of musical theater shows, which I kind of led from the piano. And I was living in Honolulu at the time, and
Let's stop there. How does a Canadian get to Honolulu? Yeah, not so fast.
Well, the way that happens is you want to thaw out, and then you get a job. So
that would do it.
That's what did it. Yeah. And so I ended up there, and I was working. Actually, my first jobs there were all in ballet, and then I started doing some musical theater. I was, working with singers a lot, accompanying, also doing both opera and musical theater. And there was a show that came up at one of the local theater companies, and they had sort of like a roster of conductors who normally did things, as there always are. And this was a show that nobody knew and nobody wanted to do. So the director of the theater called me up and said, "Hey, Warren, you want to conduct this show?" And it was a show called Here's Love. It's a Meredith Willson show. It was based on Miracle on 34th Street. And basically, if you know Meredith Willson's music, he basically had a very large vat of music. And at the top of it, he pulled off the top, and that became Music Man. Then the next tier became The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Well, this was the stuff that was at the bottom. And it was not that great a show, but it was one that, I said yes, because I say yes to everything.
You and me both. We'll talk about that for sure.
Yeah. And I said, sure, I'll do it. And at that point, all I'd ever done in terms of conducting was I had taken a class in college. And so I conducted the show. And then people thought I was a conductor. And I started getting work as a conductor. And after a few years of working as a conductor, I decided I better learn how to be a conductor. And then I took some took some summer courses. I took one where I worked with Paul Vermel, and then I took another one where I worked with Gustav Meyer. And basically, I think that's where I learned to conduct. I learned through them. And then after a few years of doing almost exclusively musical theater and opera, I got a job conducting a symphony orchestra in Tucson, Arizona. And that was the Southern Arizona Symphony. And since then, I've done mostly orchestral work, which is kind of an odd switch. But, in a sense, I have a very traditional role, right? I came out of being a pianist. People come out of the repetiteur tradition. That's more or less a very classic way to get into conducting. And that's how I ended up becoming a conductor. It was not an ambition of mine.
You jump on that. Sometimes I tell my students, you never, as a music student and undergraduate, you never know where it's going to be. So learn everything, get as much broad experience as possible, and then your life is going to take you in different directions.
Right. And mine is a classic example of that. I had not, I liked working. I mean, I just liked playing the piano. I liked working with singers. I liked working with people in a musical environment. I like practicing. I like doing all of it. And I just said yes.
Well, then we'll call the show Just Say Yes. That's great advice for a conductor, I think.
Yes, it is, for sure. Don't turn things down.
What's more natural for a pianist and for a collaborative artist is to be a conductor. You're around people all the time. You're collaborating with boards. You're collaborating with players. Your sections. I mean, it just never ends, the collaboration.
Right, absolutely. And so, I very much it was a very funny thing. It's like once I started doing it, I went, "Oh yeah, this makes sense that I'm doing it," you know. Um, and it was funny in that way because as I said, it wasn't something I had thought of doing particularly, you know.
I find it interesting that that your career is geared towards you've done so much or symphonic work.
Yeah.
What about the symphonic work has been inspiring you?
When in terms of symphonic work, well, for me, the big inspiration has always been, and if you take a look at, Musica Nova, the orchestra I have in Phoenix, a lot of what I do is unusual repertoire and different repertoire. And in terms of working, like doing symphonic repertoire, I think I always liked to read scores. I'm one of those people who likes to look at a score and hear what it sounds like. And I like to sit down at the piano and go through the parts that don't make sense, looking at it on the page and then figuring out what it is. And I've always kind of enjoyed that. And because I've composed too, I've always felt an affinity for working with instruments and things. And for me, I think that the biggest thrill has always been finding repertoire that other people don't know and that is stuff that that's really worth hearing. And I've done a ton of that stuff. And that's really been, I think, something that I feel very proud of the fact that I've done so much repertoire that is not particularly well known. Lots of premieres.
Did you found the orchestra in Scottsdale?
Um, I was the first conductor. I would not call myself. I guess some people call me the founder, but I would put it this way: if it hadn't been for the work of a lot of other people, there was no way that orchestra was being founded based on me. you know.
Founding music director.
Yeah, I was the founding music director. Yeah, and I've been there since 2003. So
And
it's
how
like
exciting to
20 years.
bring new works to life and to discover
Yeah.
works. Like I just love, I'm amazed by the composers we don't know right off the bat. I love to dig in as well. I find you learn so much more about the quote unquote famous composers by reading the other ones who were around at the same time.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's like what you do is you find that you go, oh, well, that was an influence, or that is sort of like a byway that music could have taken. A lot of the music I've done is early 20th century German rap that like composers like Franz Schreker and Erich Wolfgang Korngold, and I've done a lot of that type of repertoire. And those people were people who were taking music in a certain direction. And because they were suppressed by the Nazis, what happened is it turned the entire world musically in a very different direction. And I've often wondered what would have happened to music if that hadn't happened, because Schraker was taking music in a certain direction. Korngold was taking music in a certain direction. Now, Korngold we think of nowadays in terms of his film scores, but the operas were a different sort of idea. They used some of the same harmonic language to a certain extent, but it was an extremely interesting direction for music that music didn't go in, you know?
We're seeing Korngold's upper stage these days. There are more and more
Yes.
Kaiser from
Yeah.
Atlantises, and they're starting to make a comeback. I think there's a strong case for that.
Yeah, there is. I've done a bunch of stuff from Die Katerin, which was a fabulous opera. Das Wunder der Haliana, which was his magnum opus, which he wrote in 1929, is, in my opinion, one of the greatest operas ever written. It's been staged, I think, a total of 5 times. It was done up at Bard a couple of years ago. Wonderful production that they did up there, and I think that was the first time it's been done in the States. You know,
Incredible. Yeah,
yeah.
Leon Botstein really he chooses some fascinating
Absolutely.
repertoire.
It really does. He's fantastic. It was thrilling for me to hear it because it was a piece of music I knew. I knew the score. I got the score from Korngold's son, from George Korngold in the mid
Wow.
90s. Yeah, that's right. Before anybody had it, when you couldn't get it. So it was like, for me, it was a huge moment to be able to actually hear this extraordinary music being able to be performed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fascinating. The pre-Nazi Germany and how that
Mhm.
America's. I mean, horrors of World War II. America benefited by the influx of all these great artists who came to join us from Europe and completely changed our musical academic world. Einstein
Yeah.
and
They
just
all,
incredible the
yeah.
influence that brought here.
Yeah, and they ended up a whole bunch of them ended up in Los Angeles and became sort of like a Hollywood crowd. They'd end up playing, playing tennis with Schenberg, who loved to play tennis.
I think
It's
Schoenberg and Gershwin playing tennis together. That just blows my
it's a
mind.
great picture. I know. It's wonderful. Yeah, I
What
know.
do they talk about? I mean,
Well, there was the whole story about Gershwin talking to Schenberg and to Ravel and stuff about getting composition lessons. And I think Schenberg's line to him was, "Do you want to become a second-rate Schenberg when you're already a first-rate Gershwin? That would what do you need lessons from me for? The other thing he said is, "How much money are you making?" And he said, "You're making much more than me. Forget it."
and then you have Stravinsky. Wasn't Stravinsky? Was he in L.A. as well?
Yeah, he was in
He was
LA
in
during
China.
the war too. Yeah, he moved back to New York after, but yeah, he was in LA during the war. Yeah.
So fascinating. You've got these classical music luminaries around the Hollywood industry. Must have
Yeah.
been a fascinating time to be alive.
Well, and it's an interesting thing because sometimes they were actually approached by Hollywood to try to do things, but they had very different ideas. Like Schoenberg apparently they said they wanted him to score a film. And so what he did is he showed them what he had in mind for the music. And he said, "Well, of course, you're going to fit the film to my music, aren't you?" And they had to sort of gently explain to him that it doesn't work that way, you know?
Did Korngold modify his style when he started writing film scores? I mean,
Absolutely, yeah. It's definitely somewhat different. It's less complex harmonically. There is some of the material. It's got a similar type of sound world. Of course, they also, they required him to use an orchestrator, which was kind of a joke because he's one of the greatest orchestrators in the history of music. Um, but he basically took care of it all himself, and it was somewhat more melodic and slightly simplified. If you the textures were denser, the harmony was denser. It was a lot of cluster chords in Das Wunder der Helena, and this was he did simplify his style somewhat. I mean, if you want to really know the film scores without knowing them, listen to the Violin Concerto, because that is material that was taken from the film scores that he used in there, because he managed to get the only composer in the history of Hollywood to get the right to his own music outside of the film scores.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, he was able to do
And
that.
that violin concerto is a treasure.
Oh, it is amazing work, amazing work. Yeah.
So you're very active. So you've moved to New Jersey. What brought you to New Jersey?
Brought me to New Jersey was my son, Graham. My son Graham, when he was 10 years old, won the Morton Gould Award for composition. It was a Charlotte Bergen scholarship. It was like the first prize for young composers under the age of 18, but he was 10.
Oh my God.
And so we were talking to the people there, and we talked to Fran Richard at ASCAP, and she said, "Well, he's got to come to New York to study." So we went, and he auditioned at Juilliard, and he got in the composition program at the age of 11. And I think he was the youngest person who'd ever been accepted. So we moved here. I mean, I still was able to travel back and forth to be able to, keep the orchestra going in Arizona. But I tried to find we tried to find work here and decided, we had to take the chance for him. It was like this was an opportunity. He wasn't going to get any opportunity like that, and he needed the training and the skill set, and never regretted it for a minute. It was a perfect decision to make.
And there's so much activity in New York. I mean,
Absolutely.
there's just so much. I've grown up here, and I work in a lot of other places, but I always enjoy being in this neck of the woods. I mean,
Yeah.
if a singer gets sick and I'm doing a production, I can literally get on the phone and find one within like. It's
You know,
unbelievable.
and that for me was just like so nice. I come from Montreal, which is a place that does have an extraordinary amount of musical activity.
Love Montreal.
Um, yeah, but being in Arizona, there was not that same level of activity. And coming to New York, it was just thrilling for me to be able to, hear the finest people. And also my kid being at Juilliard, I was able to hang out there, and just amazing amounts of work that you see done at Lincoln Center and stuff. So that was, and everywhere else, and of course I like the out of the way stuff. So there's a ton of that too.
Did you ever explore that? There's so much stuff at the Lincoln Center Library. You can go to the library
Yes.
I'm always spending time there, and they have the orchestra collection is just
Isn't
fantastic as well.
fantastic. Yeah, it is. So it's like all that sort of stuff was just wonderful for me to be able to do that. But my excuse was my kids, so that's how we did it.
Well, it's quite a commitment, but shout out to Graham, who is quite a stunning. I've never heard his compositions yet. I can't wait to now explore those.
Yeah, he's a very interesting thing because the fact that he's one of those people. If you take a look at modern composition, he's one of those people who believes that the future of classical music is world music, and so a lot of his stuff takes like he wrote a string quartet called Cape Breton Set, based upon a bunch of Cape Breton fiddle tunes. He's done stuff working with Hardanger fiddle tunes from Norway. He's done stuff based upon, he wrote a string orchestra piece based entirely on gamelan music, using gamelan scales and actual gamelan tunes and stuff like that. So he's worked within this kind of like this idea of working outside of Western musical ideas in order to give new life to modern music. And I love that stuff. I mean, it's partly my fault that he's into that because, I was the one who introduced him to Lou Harrison's music when he was a little kid. So.
I did his Coro Sutro when I was a doctoral
Oh,
student.
wow.
Pat Gardner at Rutgers
Yeah.
was very close with the composer, and he had all the American gamelan pieces, and it was
Yeah.
crazy. And I loved being a part of that music. It was
Yeah.
fascinating sound colors and use of.
Amazing. Yeah, I did a number of years ago. I played his concerto for piano, violin, and small orchestra, which is based on gamelan things. I love the sound world. It's just absolutely amazing. So Harrison is somebody whose music I've always loved, but I've loved all sorts of attempts to try to, I guess at this day and age, it's considered politically incorrect a little bit. There's the whole idea of cultural appropriation. But I'm a deep believer in cultural appropriation on that level. I believe that you
Maybe it's
should
more
be
a cultural
mixing it.
assimilation or cultural I think it shows a great respect. When we learn about cultures through music.
Well, it was an interesting point. When Graham's gamelan piece was played, there was a person who had spent many years studying gamelan music and who'd lived in Bali. And she came up to him after the concert and said, "Well, you must have spent time in Bali." And he said, "No, never been there." And she said, "Well, you got it. Absolutely."
That's
You know,
incredible.
and,
What a
and
compliment.
I know, but the whole idea is that if it's treated with respect, you're going to bring something of your own to it. But things always change and advance by having the assimilation of different things, bringing things together that are different. Now, yeah, I have objections to certain types of things where there is what we could consider cultural appropriation, where you're not treating it with respect. You're not treating it. That's a whole other issue, sort of a commercialization or a watering down of other cultures' music. Yeah, that's not good. But to be able to bring it into your own language, I think you just learn an enormous amount. And music's always been that way. I mean, Telemann wrote Turkish music in the middle of the 18th century. People don't know that necessarily. His music is full of influences from non-Western sources.
The Europeans were fascinated by the Turkish.
Yes, they
You see
were.
it in Beethoven, you see it in Mozart, you see it, and that just
Yeah,
it was such an
absolutely.
interesting color in the use of percussion that
Yeah.
certainly fired them up.
There was a piano that was made that had Turkish percussion. One of the pedals was a Turkish percussion pedal
The
for
theater
the
organ of its day, right?
Yeah, it was a really yes, yeah, exactly. Amazing things. But you look at that, and there's always been this stuff. Like take a look at Les Ingalantes by Rameau, that opera. I mean, it was based partly on him having heard um, Native American music in Paris that had been brought to Paris, and he was so inspired by it that he wrote a bunch of harpsichord pieces based on it, and it became the basis of an opera. And it's a fabulous opera. I mean, it has nothing to do with Native American music really, but the inspiration was there as an undercurrent, and it did change the way he perceived his musical ideas, as well.
It's I was explaining to my son about the New World Symphony and how
Yeah,
it's not American, quote unquote, but there are some American ideas that kind of sit in there,
right.
and I think that's respectful from that composer. He was fascinated by what he heard and kind of assimilated into a very European genre and art and structure. But there is that. It's just interesting to me how we this conversation between cultures has always been going.
It is, and I think it's an essential part. It's an essential part of your growth as a musician and as a person to be able to understand things that are coming from a different perspective. I mean, as an example, one of the most interesting problems that we had with Graham's piece, the gamelan piece, was the fact that he was using gamelan scales, which are not tuned in the same way that ours are. And he was having them play pitches that were outside of the normal
So
range of our pitches.
microtones, that must have taken a lot of rehearsal time.
It didn't take as much rehearsal time as you would think,
Hmm.
because basically he had to do it on seventh and 11th harmonics, which are out of tune anyway. So we were able to use certain devices to make that work. But it was fascinating because there were people wanting to correct them, right? And that was the sound. The beauty of it was that kind of dissonance. I mean, in gamelan, the octaves are not tuned the same, right? That the octaves aren't the same. So that little buzz in the sound is what they want, Um, and I'm fascinated by that sort of stuff. I love that sort of stuff. And as I say, I think of having a vast musical curiosity is the essence of making great music for the future.
I tell my students, if you go into conductor, if you go into any musical field, you never stop learning it. There isn't a day that I don't learn something new, or I'm looking at a new score, get inspired by something I've never done before, and I feel like I'm just learning, just getting into this.
Yeah, there's, and throughout your life, you find things like all of a sudden, you'll discover a new piece and you'll go, okay, well, I didn't know anything like that was written. I mean, a couple of years ago, I came across a piece, which I should have known probably, called Capriccio Stravagante by a guy named Carlo Farina. And it was the first piece ever written for a string orchestra. And it comes from 1628. And he uses all the devices that we associate with 20th to 21st century music are there in the very first piece ever written for string
Wow,
orchestra.
I gotta look that up.
Fascinating. Oh, you've got it. There's an amazing section where it's got these incredible dissonances where he's trying to imitate a lyre and imitating all the various types of sounds that you get, like from a hurdy-gurdy and things. It's fascinating. And it's from 1628. And I just learned this piece a couple of years ago. I
I always
already
thought
broke.
that so many of the innovations we consider like effects come out of
Mhm.
opera because they're trying to create like unique
Yes.
it was what was it, the Monteverdi trying to create like punches, and
Yes.
he created pizzicato. I mean, like things like that. They're
Yes.
these kind of unique effects that are. I guess they're trying to always be descriptive. That must be the way that these innovations come.
They do, and composers who have had that sort of, we look at this and we associate it with 20th century music. But I have one of the jokes I always make is whenever we come across a complicated passage in the music of, say, Brahms, for example, I always go, "This is for all of you who believe that rhythm was invented by Stravinsky." Right? I mean, there is complex, exceedingly complex rhythm in the music of Brahms. I mean, the Third Symphony has passages where you have 5 and 6 simultaneous different rhythmic ideas going on at the same time. It's always been there. It's just been contextualized differently. And I think that's one of the things that, you're always going to contextualize in a new way. And I think that's what makes music fascinating as it goes forward, you know.
I always pay people back to isorhythm and back to the isorhythmic
Oh
motets, and
yeah,
those things are
yeah.
nasty hard to sing.
They're nasty hard. I mean, if you ever tried to do have any singers work on like Machot, like the Machot Mass or something? I mean,
I
it's
did. We
rhythmically
had
so
the
complex.
Orlando concert work with my students
Yeah,
at Seton Hall, and that was fascinating because it was mostly music from the 12th and 1300s, which I
yeah,
don't get to do very often. I'm always interested in it, but it's outside of what I do on a daily basis. But it was fascinating to learn about,
yeah, and complex, so difficult. Some
and to
of
hear
that
them
stuff.
sing it, it was just like, oh, it's just four of the best singers.
Yeah. You just wonder, I mean, when I look at like the Macho Mass and I look at that and I go, they could sing this, they could sing this. That tells you they had tremendous rhythmic sophistication, you know, in the 14th century. Yeah.
Paris always had that cutting edge, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it
It's a
always did.
hotbed
Yeah.
of creativity and modernism.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder what's being created in Paris today. We've always had such crazy modernism and unique ideas there. I wonder what the
Well, there's Ecrom, so I mean, I don't know what they're doing now that Boulez is gone, but there's they've always had things, and of course, part of it is that the French public, unlike the American public, loves novelty for its own sake, right? And that is a characteristic. And I'm from Montreal. It's similar there. They love novelty for its own sake. And it was kind of an adjustment coming to the States and realizing people in the States generally aren't that way. They don't like novelty just for its own sake. But you do something ridiculous in Montreal and you'll get an audience.
Cirque du Soleil was created in Montreal. So.
Yes, it was. From a grant from the Canada Council. Yeah. Government funding created the Cirque du Soleil, which is a kind
They
of
still functioning.
story.
They were so big.
Oh,
They
yeah.
were everywhere in the world. They had to retool for a bit.
Yeah, the pandemic and stuff, and they had a few problems with that, but yeah, they're still around. They're still around.
So you bring up the pandemic, and that was such a devastating time for
Yeah.
musicians. What did you do during that time to keep your musical juices flowing?
Um, I practiced the piano for the first time in years, and I discovered I really love practicing the piano. So that was kind of one of the things that happened, and I went, oh yeah, I used to do this a lot. This is like really really wonderful stuff. I did that. I discovered a lot of scores. I listened to a ton of music, which I do anyway, but I actually listened to a lot more during that time. A lot of new music. Um, I took the time. One of the things I decided to do was really try to understand Boulez's music
Hmm.
because was beginning just before the pandemic. I realized I was beginning to understand how his music was put together, and so I decided that was one of my projects. I went, oh, and then I realized it's all color over very large pedal tones, and I went, now it's just beautiful. And this is one of those things that it's a transformative thing that can happen if you just take enough time with certain composers. So I decided to take time with a few composers I had difficulty with, and he was one of them. And I practiced a lot of Schumann.
It's a beautiful evolution.
Yeah,
We've had this is our 304th show, and we were born out of the pandemic because I'm as a
yeah,
conductor. I didn't see any of my colleagues. I wasn't doing any operas, and I wasn't traveling. So I'm trying to think now what I was doing lots of online and virtual rehearsals and stuff like that to keep my
yeah,
communities whole. But the virtual stuff was never it's not the same as being in the room with your artists and your
no,
musicians.
no,
So, these conversations I always find so fascinating. Everyone has such a different approach. We had singers from the Met who became real estate agents who are now back on the Met and still doing real estate. It's pretty
yeah.
incredible. We've had other ones who started podcasts and some who did voiceover acting. And I'm just fascinated by how creative the creative class can be.
Yeah, and but you have to do something, right? You're not going to sit back and do nothing. But you're going to in a situation like that, it's adversity always creates new opportunity, doesn't it?
Certainly
And
does.
and so I discovered a whole bunch of things and discovered a bunch of new music, and it put me in the unfortunate position of having another 10 years worth of music that I want to do, and I have to find ways to get it done.
So much music, so little time when you think
So
about it, right?
yeah, it's so true. That was part of what it was, discovering that for me. And but I did, as I said, I learned a lot as well. And coming back to the piano, I think was the big thing though for me. Spending more time practicing.
Do you concertize on the piano these days?
No, I do not. I played the Chaminade Concertstück with the New Jersey Intergenerational Orchestra about a year ago. This past season, I did the Schumann Introduction and Allegro Appassionata, the Opus 92. So I play sometimes, when it comes up. But I have not concertized, even since then. I mean, basically, this takes a lot of practice.
The time is always our
Yeah,
enemy, right? It's as a conductor, you're always there's so
you're
much to
busy.
do.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot to do and stuff
Whether
like
it's
that.
budgets, whether it's planning, whether it's
Yep.
projections. I've got a call at 9 tonight. I got to be on my next call to
Oh
talk to
my
my
gosh.
board about.
Yeah.
I've got auditions coming up for a musical and
Yeah.
forecasting an opera, and it never ends.
It never does. And a lot of it is non-musical, which I think a lot of people don't realize how much of that stuff we do, how much of it is non-musical stuff. And but and that's not the fun part, but it's the necessary part.
You know what you. I've learned to really enjoy the administrative part of it as
Uh-huh.
as an artist. I try to keep myself. So I carve my time of study very carefully, and I try to find that time. But I think they're both so equally important. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
building a house, right? You have to have that foundation to be
Yeah.
able to do the art.
Well, and I was thinking about that in relation to, people say, well, did you found the Musica Nova Orchestra? And no. You see, because I had certain skills, but I needed those administrative skills. I needed those personnel skills. I needed those just sort of overall skills from other people to be able to create it. I was one piece of the puzzle, but I certainly wasn't the only piece.
What do they say? A conductor without an ensemble is a crazy person waving their arms in front of a mirror.
Oh dear. Yeah. Sometimes I feel like we're still crazy even when we're doing it in front of people.
It's more like a, yeah, it's a calling just as much as a vocation, isn't it?
It's a very odd thing. I mean, as I've often said to people, I said, you have to realize you're not making the music, you know? You are there, you're a conduit in a way, but you're not actually producing the sound, you know? You have to find a way to perhaps convince people to produce the sound, but it's an odd place to be because you're not producing it. And the other thing is that how do you learn to be a conductor? I mean, the most important part of it is being in front of an orchestra. And the first time you stand in front of an orchestra, it's not like you could have practiced for it, you know?
So you have to know your music. I said, tell my young students, you
Yeah.
must know the music. That's one. That's the base. And then there's so many other considerations.
There's so many other considerations. But the
And
first is know your music. You have to know it.
instincts are important, but
Yeah.
it's like the instincts grow over time. The way you
Yeah.
mold sound, the way you react to sound, the way you
Yeah.
react to people. It's
Right.
all.
Yeah, and it's a very different profession than it was 70 or 80 years ago. I mean, we've all heard those famous Toscanini recordings of him, telling the people all sorts of terrible things. You couldn't do that nowadays,
Not if you want to come back.
Not if you want to come back, right? Exactly.
Orchestras are so much. They have so much more say in the equation, which is probably a good thing.
It's probably a good thing. Absolutely. I definitely think it is a good thing. I think it also makes for better music making if it's cooperative.
We talked about this when we were together. That
Yeah.
there's less tolerance for horrible behavior these days. I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very positive development, I think, definitely is. And it's nice to see that. There was this idea, I think, at one point of artistic temperament being, that you had to tolerate really bad behavior. And you don't, there's so much talent
Boards
around.
don't. Orchestras don't.
Yeah. Well, there's so much talent around these days that you can always find somebody who isn't going to do that, who will take the job. I mean, you've noticed it. I mean, I've listened to recordings from 50, 75, or 100 years ago, and the quality of playing these days is extraordinarily better than it was. Uh,
I tell students there's more people in conservatory now than there ever has been in the history of music.
wow, yeah.
Even though there's less jobs, I think these days.
There's fewer jobs, right? But the level is so extraordinarily high. I mean, it was an interesting thing. Like I did with an ensemble in Phoenix last year. I did the Stravinsky Octet,
Mm.
and I remember hearing, and we did it on 2 rehearsals. And I remember saying to them, I said, we are able to do this on 2 rehearsals today. I mean, 50 years ago, they would have taken 6 to be able to do it. It's just we are so much more used to this. The standards of the playing and all that has risen to such an extraordinarily extent. I think we're living in many ways a golden age in terms of musical performance.
It is a new. That's interesting. You're a very positive person, which I am as well. I'm always half glasses half full. I mean, the
Yeah,
budgets are much smaller, so we certainly have less rehearsals these days. It's just the way
yeah,
it goes. But that
we do.
means I send the parts in advance mode so everyone can practice.
Mhm.
Everyone's got the
Absolutely.
music. They come into the
Yeah,
first rehearsal. We're reading it down.
yeah.
It's I've never had the luxury of having lots of rehearsal time. Only when I go to Europe.
Oh,
Like, oh,
well, on the mainland Europe, not in England, you
oh,
know. In England, you do not get rehearsal time. I mean, I remember, well, I lived in London when I was first learning to conduct, and I had spent a year basically hanging around the English National Opera and watching all the opera rehearsals, trying to learn how to conduct. And and I remember I was associated with a group called the Rehearsal Orchestra. They were called the Rehearsal Orchestra because they got 3 rehearsals,
wow.
which in London was considered an absolutely extraordinary luxury. Most of them did it on one. And I remember one of the musicians saying, he said, "Yeah, when we get 2 rehearsals, we don't know what to do with the second one." you know, but they were such phenomenal readers. I mean, I saw one performance they did, Malcolm Arnold's Fifth Symphony, which is one of the great symphonies of the 20th century. I recommend everybody listen to it. There's a YouTube video of me conducting it, which
Oh,
you can watch. But Malcolm Arnold's Fifth Symphony is one of the great symphonies. And I spoke to the guy. It was for Arnold's 70th birthday when I was there. And the guy conducting it, I said, it's a complex score. I said, "How many rehearsals did you get?" They had one, and they did it on one rehearsal, and I was just flabbergasted at the time, that they were able to do such a complex work on so little rehearsal. But
I just putting your link in the chat here of the Malcolm Arnold, so if
yeah,
people can see it and experience this cool piece.
yeah,
There
oh,
it
it's an
is.
amazing piece. It is. I call the ending of that piece one of the most devastating moments I have ever heard
Hmm.
in music. I mean, what the way he pulls the rug out from under you in terms of your expectations at the end of the piece is unbelievable. Second movement is absolutely gorgeous, and it's a very dark work, but it's also Malcolm Arnold, so it's got jazz influences in it. It's got a lot of kind of humorous stuff thrown in as well. Um, as I say, one of the great works of the 20th century.
Well,
You know,
you have such a depth of repertoire knowledge. It's great to talk. I love talking to colleagues. I tell everyone the conductors don't get to interact with each other as much as you think because we have our own little
yeah,
musical world that we live in
right.
and we kind of at the center of them. It's always exciting when I get to talk to colleagues like you, and so really appreciate the time.
Yeah, the thing is that we all have our own kind of little areas. And it's like you go, "Oh, you know this and I don't." It's always like that. And you've explored this particular area, whereas I haven't, and those things it's always fascinating for me to do that. In my case, I have the peculiar thing about having lived in various different worlds and having existed in them for a period of time, developed a certain depth, and then moved on. So for many years, I hadn't done a lot of standard repertoire. And now that I'm working with New Jersey Intergenerational Orchestra, I'm doing more standard rep. I mean, in our concert that's coming up in May with them, I'm doing Brahms' First Symphony. And it's only the second time I've done that, you know?
It's exciting. Whenever I do the standard rep, I come back to it. I'm always like, it's always fascinating to. I look at it differently because maybe I'm
Yeah.
different. It's
Yeah.
just fascinating to when I open that score up again. I said, "Oh, why did I do it that way?" Interesting,
Yeah, I know. I did a couple of years ago. I did a Beethoven 7, and I had a part that I had bowed 15 years ago, and I was looking at my bowings, going, "No," you know.
Try that again.
What was I thinking? You do that sort of stuff. You come back to it. But that was actually interesting because Musica Nova, the group in Phoenix, we do almost all unfamiliar repertoire. Once in a while, we'll do a familiar piece, and they get so excited I mean, one year we did Schumann Rhenish Symphony.
Mm.
One year we did Beethoven 7. And whenever we do that, it's like such a treat. And I'm going, that's what you want it to be. You want those standard pieces to be a treat. So for me, that was like, oh, it's so nice that they're coming at it with that enthusiasm instead of this jaded attitude, like, oh, here we go again, to
What
do
do you
that.
think the conductor's role in community? Like, you do lots of different types of music
Yeah.
making, like the intergenerational orchestra and your professional orchestras and other communities. What's the conductor's role in creating community?
Well, the thing is that if you have, there's two types of community. There's the community of musicians, and then there's the community of music and of making music. And I think, for example, one of the things that I'm really glad that I have an orchestra like the New Jersey Intergenerational Orchestra that has a lot of that has a lot of non-professional players in it, because I think music making for people is a lifelong thing that's tremendously important at every level and at every level of development. And it offers you a way to have a community that is so profoundly rewarding that you want that opportunity for everybody. And one of the things about New Jersey Intergenerational Orchestra, we have different levels, right? We have a prelude ensemble for people who are fairly basic level. We have an intermezzo ensemble for people a little bit more, and then we have the symphony orchestra where we do standard rep, but a lot of the players are amateur players, but they're all gaining something. They're all gaining something, and we have people who are in their 80s, and we have people who are 12 and 13 years old, and they're all gaining something, and they're gaining something from that interaction. So I see the community that you get out of music making as profoundly important for a society, because it creates a tremendous amount of health in the society. And the idea of the bringing music to the community is, there's several things. First of all, it's about, for your audience, it's about showing them the musical traditions that have been created over the years. It's showing them the ways in which they themselves could become part of a musical community. And, having a community that is based on music and based on art is, I think, the most profoundly satisfying thing you could have. I remember one year I wrote the music to uh, a sort of cantata for the theater that was based on the life of Princess Kaiulani, and who was the last princess of Hawaii. Liliuokalani was the last queen, and she was the heir apparent, but she died, and then they overthrew the monarchy. And there was this sort of a cantata for the theater that was written. I wrote the music for it, and we played it at the Edinburgh Festival, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And I remember being in Edinburgh there in that during the festival season, and every venue in that town was turned into a performance venue. There were plays going on, there was music going on, there was thousands of things happening in that venue, and it was the most amazing sense of community. I have never seen anything like it. There is no community equal to what you can get out of bringing the arts together, and by having people all involved in the creative process and going to the different concerts. I remember there was one concert I went to. There was a guy who was playing, he decided to do all the Prokofiev piano sonatas. He was playing them
Oh,
on an electronic keyboard in a tiny little room that was at the back of a church. And, we came in, and it was called Prokofiev and Coffee. And he served coffee, and you sat and you drank a cup of coffee and you listened to him play various, and it was the most wonderful thing, because that
coffee
type
and
of,
classical music. I'm in. It's like,
oh yeah, no, me too, totally. But that whole idea, it was like, and there were small venues, and some of it was very experimental, and some of it was very traditional. And the idea of having all these different types of artistic things going on, I said to myself when I was in Edinburgh, I going, that's what I'd like the world to be like. I would like the entire world to be like this. I would want there to be constant creative things happening. And then maybe we wouldn't do bad things, because we'd be doing these wonderful
So
creative things.
positive. It's so positive when people work together and you have this
Yeah,
common. You know, I always tell my undergrads that if our Senate could probably play an ensemble together, it would be very
yeah.
different. If they could play music together, it would heal those divisions somewhat.
Well, there that is, of course, the idea behind the thing that Barenboim set up with Edward Said in the West East Divan Orchestra that they have, which has Palestinian and Israeli kids playing side by side in the orchestra, and you know, it they become a human being. It creates humanity. Music creates humanity, and it
Breaks down the
bridges
borders. Yep, it's a
it.
beautiful thing.
So, what is our role in the community? Our role is community. Our role is to create community. Our role is that we are the ones who are actually creating the most positive environment you can for everyone. And this is the more the merrier. It should be supported at every level. When you're supporting music, you're supporting your community in the best way possible. You know.
Thank you so much, Warren. It's just absolute pleasure to talk to you. How can
Great.
people find out more about your work and your upcoming performances?
Okay, well, let's see. You can go to uh, the website for the New Jersey Intergenerational Orchestra, which is njio.org. You can go to the website for the Musica Nova Orchestra, which is musicanovaaz.org, and see what we're doing. Well, there, by the way, I have an upcoming concert that we're doing with a group called Harmony Project Phoenix, which takes a bunch of underprivileged kids, and we're doing a side-by-side concert with these underprivileged kids, and we're doing a piece that was worked by a Mexican composer, Marquez, and it is based upon some of the writings of Malala. And so
Hmm.
we're taking all of, and this is done, and then we're doing it with a chorus, and these kids are playing alongside us. And that's happening on May 6th, I think it is. But anyways, it's that weekend where we have a few performances of it. And then I'm coming back to New Jersey, May 21st. We're doing Brahms' First Symphony and the Dittersdorf Harp Concerto with it at Summit Middle School. So njio.org and musicanovaaz.org. They've got lots of stuff about me. And you can look up Musica Nova on the YouTube channel. We've got vast amounts of recordings on there over the past 15 years.
Well, thank you so much, and be sure to check out this wonderful artist, this deep thinker, and a great person too. So, thank you so much, Warren, and great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you for joining us on Music Matters with Jason Tramm. Please give us a subscribe and smash that bell icon for the most up-to-date information on our upcoming topics. Thank you so much for joining us, and remember, keep music alive.